This is a bottle of wine. Very expensive wine. In fact, at 30,000 euros a bottle, it's the most expensive drop of plonk in the world. From what I gather, it's basically a fancy Bordeaux, but something about the terroir, the ungrafted vines, and the old-fashioned method of viticulture makes it worth this price tag. At least to a small elite group of people eating tiny expensive things on giant plates and sniffing the glass as though it contained molten gold. Which, frankly, at that price it does. Anyway, our interest is in the name of this dubiously pricey bottle of vino. As you may see on the label, it's called Liber Pater. And this is interesting because this is the deity on whom we call in this episode. The estate's name, Liber Pater, one wine connoisseur's website confidently asserts, is taken from the ancient Roman god Dionysus, who fittingly translates as the free father. Another wine connoisseur's guide explains, Liber Pater takes its name from an ancient Roman god that was associated with Bacchus. Liber Pater was considered the god of vines, wine, abundance, and even fertility. Another, clearly aware that he's not really sure what he's talking about at all, states simply, the term Liber Pater refers to the cult of Dionysus, Bacchus, the god of wine. And finally, another writes, few indeed will have heard of Liber Pater, its name redolent of an eccentric campaign to liberate an aristocratic patriarch whimsically, but hardly inscribed in the collective psyche of those wines that are famous above all for their price tag. So those are words. I'm not sure what they mean when you put them all together, but we get the sense it's all very ancient and it sounds posh. This sort of word salad is indicative of the general confusion surrounding the god Liber, which is fair enough. These are people that spit expensive wine into buckets, not ancient historians. And if you look online, you'll find all sorts of similar statements. Skipping over obvious errors, Dionysus is not a Roman god, for example, and Liber Pater is not a term referring to a cult, but the name of a god, and so on. It is reasonable that people who speak of him at all are not really very clear about who he is. As the repeated conflations with Dionysus and Bacchus suggest, this is a deity very much in the shadows of Olympus, one whose identity has been lost by being submerged in that of another, better-known god of the Greco-Roman pantheon. And so, as you know, if you've been following along on our journey across the ancient Roman religious landscape, this is a god that belongs in our series, and our quest in this episode will be to pull him into the light. And so, let us follow the winding vine, the tangled ivy, and that earthy, grounded aroma with hints of plum and white pepper, and let us enter the realm of Liber. The inventor of wine is called Liber, not from the license which he gives to our tongues, but because he liberates the mind from the bondage of cares and emancipates it, animates it, and renders it more daring in all that it attempts. This explanation from Seneca is a good place to start, as it explains something crucial about Liber and his name, which means literally free. This is obviously the root of many familiar English words like liberty, liberal, and liberation. What's important is that Seneca here differentiates license and loose speech from freedom from worries and cares and the resulting animating, liberating spirit. This is the spirit of Liber, and it immediately puts us somewhere different from the revelry and debauchery often associated with Dionysus and Bacchus. Liber, in the Roman world, was considered the inventor of wine and viticulture, but he's much more than that. Arguably, this wasn't even his most important or defining feature, although this is what modern people tend to home in on, if they speak of him at all. So what we'll bear in mind as we move forward is this aspect of freedom, as that's key to this deity, and it carries with it a whole spectrum of connotations, as we will see. Part of this, though, is indeed the freedom wine offers in the release from inhibitions, and it's for this reason he most obviously collides with the Dionysian world of dripping grapes. As time moved on, even for Romans, the clear parallels and points of contact with Dionysus and the vine confused and conflated much about Liber with Dionysus. And even Romans came to see his name as a byword for the religious aspects of wine generally. So we in the modern world may be excused our own confusions. But let it be stated here that if we're talking about Roman counterparts of deities in the Greek pantheon, the Roman counterpart to Dionysus was Bacchus. Clear and simple. It's true that some Romans came to use the name of Liber sometimes as if it were synonymous with Bacchus and Dionysus, but this is loose speech and poeticisms mostly, and these were not synonyms in practice. Liber was a very old and very Roman deity, with a very different range to Bacchus. So, in order to decant Liber from this tangle of crushed grapes and vine leaves, it will be best to try and get a clear handle on who these other deities were. Knowing who they were and what they represented will help illuminate more clearly who Liber was and was not. Dionysus is often miscast as merely the god of wine and revelry, but he's a very complex, powerful, and eerie deity. For my money, he's actually one of the most terrifying of the entire pantheon, and I love him for it, but he scares me when I think deeply about him. Although ancient mythology is full of monsters and monstrous behavior, it's Dionysus who has sometimes made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Sometimes when Dionysus enters an ancient text, he has genuinely sent a chill down my spine. And I think it's because the danger and darkness that he represents are not ones that are out there in the world, rather they're internal ones within us. And unlike all the make-believe monsters, these dangers and darknesses are very visceral and very real. So although wine and revelry is fun, there's a much more disquieting undercurrent to his domain. He's a liminal deity in the true sense of the word. He stands at the boundary between many things, most fundamentally perhaps, between civilized and uncivilized being. When people hear that he was the god of ecstasy, the frivolous, superficial understanding takes that to mean that he's a god who likes to party, and they think, hell yeah, this is a god for me. And this feeds into the kind of thinking that likes to imagine all of classical history was one giant orgy until Christianity came along. But ecstasy is no frivolous thing in this context. It comes from the Greek ekstasis, which means to be or to stand outside of oneself, to be beside yourself, something we say as a figure of speech, but think about that literally, to be beside yourself with laughter, with worry, with rage. It's a removal of yourself, from yourself. Some of you may have had this experience in your life for one reason or another, where you are watching yourself as if from a distance, as if there is some sort of automaton almost in the physical body acting in the world, and then there is this thing that you are watching yourself. It's disconcerting to say the least, and that is the true meaning of ecstasy. Sometimes it just happens, meditation will take you there, but it can be precipitated by substances like wine. It's a movement to the very edges of your own being, and what you find there can be very scary. It takes you to the brink of chaos or madness. So Dionysus is, in this way, an intrinsically unstable, destabilizing deity. He comes in this unsettling way to unsettle, and he erodes distinctions we rely upon to orient ourselves. Self versus other, man versus woman, sanity versus madness. And he is dangerous. He's a strange Olympian. He arrived late, according to myth, although there's reason to suspect he's actually older than all of them. And he's not an original member of the Olympian family. He came triumphing in from the east with tigers and panthers and a retinue of revelers. He demands recognition and punishes refusal, but not with thunderbolts, but with ecstasy. And that's precisely the horror of him. His punishments often come as gifts, madness disguised as revelation, freedom that strips away identity and sanity. He can make you destroy yourself enthusiastically. The mania, what we would call mania, associated with his revels are an altered perception of reality. It can be a gift from the gods that inspires poetry and prophecy. But in the case of Dionysus, his divine possession is often a delusional state in which madness is experienced as truth. And what's scary is that there may be truth in it, but it may also lead you to ruination and even violence. Now, in Greek culture, all of this was channeled and had a valid cultural place, which was all about the theatre. Tragedy, as in stage plays of tragedy, emerged from Dionysian cult and ritual. In Athens, the city Dionysia was a religious festival in honor of Dionysus that took place in the theatre. Theatrical performance was not a secular pastime, but a ritual that was civic and sacred all at once. On the stage, the collapse of boundaries and the instability of identity had a place. The theatrical mask and the eerie gaze of the eyes through it was experienced as a direct epiphany of the god himself. And the performance of tragedy permitted a collective encounter with disorder and suffering. It allowed a contained exploration of what Dionysus unleashes: chaos, transgression, pain, and transformation. This was a Dionysian space, and the experience as an audience member was absorbing and transformative, but confined within the structure and ritual of the theatre. Overall, the experience was supposed to be cathartic in the best manner of an encounter with the god. Beyond the confinement of the theatre, however, his encouragement to undo boundaries could be threatening on both an individual and a communal level. Reveling in the world of Dionysus could undo the ties that hold a society and its morals together. And that's why, when we get to the Roman world, his cult becomes problematic. In Rome, we have Bacchus in the place of Dionysus, and Bacchus still represents ecstasy, frenzy, and the breakdown of boundaries. Roman writers preserved the core Dionysian motifs, maenads, divine possession, and the punishment of disbelievers, but these are problematic to Roman sensibilities. And while Rome too had its theatres and plays, culturally they had a different place and importance in society than they had held in classical Athens. And so the state wrestled with Bacchic rites and Bacchic revelers as something anathema to Roman morals, and indeed as something dangerous to the very fabric of Roman society. His rites were clandestine and transgressive, blurring gender, class, and authority, exactly the identity-eroding power we associate with Dionysus, and clearly something that would affront the Roman state. So it was that in 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree restricting and tightly regulating Bacchic rites across Italy. It was a crackdown on a massive scale and an enormous, scandalous affair. It seems, if our ancient sources are to be believed, that the Bacchic cult had become a debauch that was secret, but so epic in scale it seems hard to imagine it slipped under the senatorial radar for so long. If you're following current affairs, think P. Diddy and Hollywood, and you're more or less in the right territory. There's an ancient account of the scandal by the historian Livy, and it really is striking how easily you could swap out Rome for Hollywood in that account, and what we are hearing coming out of the trial about the world of celebrity white parties. I was going to read it to you and talk you through it, but in the end it's far too long to add here. But if you're interested, I could maybe make a little supplementary video to this one, just going over the text. So let me know if that's something of interest. Otherwise, suffice it to say that if half of what the historians tell us is true, it really was outrageous. And so there was a massive and terrible crackdown on Bacchic revelers, a lot of people were arrested and even executed. After this, the cult continued, but it was heavily restricted and surveyed. No congregations over 5 people were allowed. Mandatory state permissions were required for gatherings, funds were confiscated, and no more male priests were allowed. Bacchus was still respected, and his aesthetic was also appreciated, but monitored and tamed in this way, he had his hands tied somewhat. And the danger that emanates from Dionysus in Greece is definitely diluted in what we get in the end from Bacchus in Rome. The imagery of jolly revelry and drunken fun is, for the most part, pleasant rather than edgy. So yes, wine and abandon, but I think you can see that there's a lot more going on with these deities than simple partying. And I think you also get a sense that Bacchus in Roman society doesn't hold exactly the same place as Dionysus in Greece. So although we rightly hold these two up as counterparts, even that comparison isn't exact. So Liber, finally, where does he fit into all of this? Well, I mentioned that he was the inventor of viticulture in Roman society, but this was not the only string to his bow. In some accounts, he also discovered the art of beekeeping, which makes him intersect nicely with the world of Melona, which we explored in the previous episode. Liber was, in fact, extremely fond of honey, and liber, which are honey cakes, were offered to him during his festival, the Liberalia. The father god enjoys honey, Ovid tells us, and it's right that we give to its discoverer glistening honey soaked in a warm cake. Liber was often referred to as a father god, and so he's often called Liber Pater. As a father figure, we're clearly not exactly in a Dionysian realm. He was also an agricultural deity, as his cultivation of the vine and the keeping of the bees suggests. And as I stated at the beginning when I quoted Seneca, the liberation Liber represents was a fruitful one. And that really is the key. I took some time to explain what Dionysus and to some extent Bacchus represented in some detail, because I hope now that the delineation is very clear to you. While Dionysian ecstasy can be fun, obviously, and even light-hearted, it does have this very edgy, dangerous, and destructive power to it. That kind of identity-dissolving, self-destructive freedom is not the same as the liberation Liber provides, although around the edges it may look similar. Liber was an indigenous, italic god, and if you wanted to characterize him more accurately than simply pointing to Dionysus or Bacchus, you'd be better to call him a god of fertility and freedom. His connection to wine plays into this, but the Dionysian breakdown of boundaries, ecstatic truth, and madness as revelation is entirely incompatible with what Liber represents. In fact, it seems that his later conflation with Bacchus was actually a shrewd political move to try and contain and tame the wilder, ecstatic, intoxicated side of Bacchus in the altogether healthier realm of Liber. The addition of Pater to his name actually came late, in the 1st century BCE. And this is not to say that Liber was by any means a prude. As a fertility god, he was specifically a god of seed and germination, and this is why we get what may seem to be a strange combination of things under his auspices. Seed, of course, in the agricultural sense is obvious and relates to the germination and growth of the crops, but it refers to human seed too, in the biblical sense, and remember that the Latin for seed is semen. Liber was a deity of all this kind of fertility that comes from what Augustine refers to as liquid seed, which he says includes not only the juice of fruits, among which somehow wine holds first place, but also the seed, semen, of animals. And so wine, in particular, is this fertile kind of juice that has a special place in the hierarchy of germinating things, and it holds a particular relevance here for Liber, not only because he presides over it, but because of its liberating effects. As a kind of aphrodisiac in its relaxing effect on human relations, let's say, it's freeing in terms of inhibitions, but also, even more specifically, it helps to oil the path to the union and liberation of those other juices that lead to procreation. Liber absolutely presides over that sort of bodily liberation too. So while we might see an overlap here with Dionysian revelry, we have to differentiate this healthy, salubrious and productive kind of fertility and germination from those destructive, Puff Daddy-style degenerate parties in Rome. Liber had a partner called Libera, who we hear of less, but she was the female counterpart to Liber, and Libera took care of those same things in the female domain that Liber took care of in the male. And the festival for Liber, which later came also to include Libera, was called, as I mentioned earlier, the Liberalia. It was held in March, in spring. And this will hopefully seem less crazy now than it's sometimes portrayed to be. At this festival, a representation of a phallus was ceremonially brought in from the fields outside the city into Rome to the singing of rude and bawdy songs. Given the remit of this god, this is nothing particularly debaucherous or silly. This was the festival at which young boys who were coming of age took off their childhood clothes and put on the toga of a man, the toga virilis, the symbol of a free, adult, male citizen. And the free here is important too, as again this is part of Liber's domain. The freedom he represented was also that of citizenship and belonging. The grown boy coming into manhood, liberated from the restrictions of childhood, coming into his own fertility, into his place in free society. You can see how all these are not disparate things, but all part of the same complex of ideas. And of course there was also merriment and wine. Liber was a rustic deity, and this idea of political freedom is a final but very important aspect of his character, and something which is, again, very different from the worlds of Dionysus and Bacchus. Political freedom here means the full status and rights of a Roman citizen. So this is, in theory, something very civilizing rather than something which pushes over the boundaries of the civilized into chaos and dissolution. He was a god of the Roman plebs, the working classes. Libertas was the Roman word for freedom, an ideal held so dearly it was also a deity in its own right. And this kind of freedom in the Roman context meant to be legitimate and to have full civic status and not be bounded by the yoke of slavery. In other words, again, it's a liberty from restriction and constraint. Liber, therefore, embodied popular liberty too. He always retained his rustic air and folk character, and there's something very benign and beguiling about him, I think. He's a genial god of ripening fields and swelling vines, of warm spring air and the body's fulfillment and gladness in itself. He's the guardian of fertility, procreation, and the vital energies that surge through all nature, and the freedom he brings is earthy, sunlit, and unashamed. And I don't know what he'd think of €30,000 bottles of wine in his name, but I imagine, given his egalitarian and working-class sensibilities, he would laugh heartily at it and spit it out, but not into a sommelier's bucket. He's a down-to-earth deity of shared harvests, sticky hands in the vineyards, and drunken laughter in the shade of bounteous trees, so I rather think that wine is poorly named as well as overpriced. And so, chin-chin and cheers to all. Here's the poet Virgil on good old Liber Pater. Every vineyard ripens in generous increase. Fullness comes to hollow valleys and deep glades, and every spot towards which the god has turned his comely face.